Good morning.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
All right, honors government class. We are going to discuss the Article 3 of the Constitution, which discusses the judicial branch of government. Now, as we look at the Constitution, Article 3 is by far the shortest of the three branches as far as what is included in the Constitution. And really, guys, the Supreme Court is the only court that is mentioned in the Constitution. All other courts, the Constitution says, will be created by Congress and then by the states. Okay, so what we have in the United States, ladies and gentlemen, is a dual court system. We have federal courts and we have state and local courts. Okay, it's a little bit like federalism, yes? Which you guys certainly understand and know. Federalism. So, you've got federal courts, and then you've got state and local. Now, the only federal court that is mentioned is the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay? How many U.S. Supreme Courts are there?
One.
There's one. Okay? Okay? And then there's 9 justices on the Supreme Court. Okay? All other courts that we talk about today underneath the Supreme Court are created by Congress. Which means as Congress createth, Congress can do away with.
The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away.
Hello? Okay.
Hello.
Now, if you have your book, if you turn there, you'll see on page 102. This 102 looks pretty confusing. Okay, so I'm going to deconfuse that for you. Or deconstruct that for you. Okay? And on the board here, in a much simpler manner, so that you are not overwhelmed by this idea. And so this is something that a lot of our students, high school students, don't really know or understand. Because a lot of people don't get to their senior year, don't understand how the court system works. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to break that down a little bit for you. Okay, so these courts are all created by Congress underneath these. These are federal courts. All right, so we're going to have what's called the federal appeals courts or appellate courts, which are also called circuit courts. Does it say circuit courts on there?
U.S. Circuit Courts of Appeal.
Okay, so spell circuit for me.
C-I-R-C-U-I-T.
C-U-I-T. Right? Okay, now there are 13 of these. Geographically distributed across the country. Okay, so there's 13 regions. Actually, there's 12 regions, and then there's the federal district court. Or the Federal Appeals Court in Washington, D.C. Okay, so the rest are regional. Does anybody know what circuit Kansas is in? It's 1 through 12.
7.
6. 9.
Before that. 4. 6.
1.
3. 9.
Two.
We're in the 10.
Oh.
Okay.
I guess the 1.
Okay. Now, with these guys, each one of these circuits basically has a 24-judge panel. Okay, these are federal judges, 24-judge panel. Okay, so each president who gets to choose these, right? The president does. The Senate has to confirm these federal judges. Okay, so when vacancies come up, they have to be filled by the president. Okay, and confirmed by the Senate. All right, and then, what's the book say? How many district courts? 91, or is it 94? 94? 94 district courts. These are federal district courts, okay? Wichita has one of these, okay? We have a federal courthouse in the city of Wichita. We're one of the 94th lucky cities, 94 lucky cities. Okay, which obviously these are bigger cities around the country. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, and so these are really where the trials are held in federal courts generally. And then this is an appeals court, and this is an appeals court. Supreme Court is an appellate court. Okay? So, these are your upper courts, and these are your lower courts. Okay, these are just some terms, judicial terms. Okay. Now, if we go over to the states, now because the states are free to kind of set up their own systems, they do vary a little bit, but most of them are very similar. And all 50 states have state Supreme Courts. Okay? And all 50 states do have state appeals courts. Now, this area below here is where 95% of the interactions that American citizens will have with the courts are going to take place in this box down here.
District trial court.
Well, these are local courts. So you have divorce court, you have juvenile courts, you have traffic courts, you have small claims. Okay, so these could be city or municipal. And county courts. So 95% of all interactions that people have with the courts take place here. Yeah.
So the federal courts, like the 94 that are located in the
Yeah.
states, are those just for federal offenses?
Yes.
So since like minor drug crimes, those are technically federal offenses, right?
Well, okay, so just take marijuana, which is federally banned substance, right? There are also laws in the state of Kansas against marijuana. And we have every city or state is going to have different sentencing guidelines for how much possession, let's say you have a joint, okay, which is going to be less than, I don't know how much, I don't understand, grams. Okay, usually this is measured in grams, okay, how much it weighs, okay, and so, or ounces, right? So, like an ounce of pot is quite a bit, right? I don't know. It's quite a bit. I remember when I was growing up, it was like you didn't want to have more than a certain amount, right? Because then becomes like a felony, like with intent to distribute. Because if you have a pound of pot, okay, that's probably not for personal use. You know what I mean? You're probably going to try and sell that. So there's a different crime. Do you know something I don't know, guys? Is there like a limit where in Wichita they're looking at, do you know, or?
You just said 27
I think there's a
grams.
limit in Wichita, you can at 27 grams an ounce, and that like in some places, like states that have marijuana for recreational and medicinal use, for example,
Yeah.
you're able to possess 2 ounces, which is quite a bit,
Yeah.
per person, and you're able to grow at least 2 marijuana plants.
You're allowed to grow it in
Well,
some
you have
states?
to do it,
Okay.
like, certified.
Well, if you have it, if you have a medicinal marijuana card,
Okay.
registration, then you
Because in some states, I know growing marijuana is a felony. Okay, so I mean you've got to know the law in your state, your community. I sometimes watch that show. Live PD, is it? Yeah. So you're getting cops from all different parts of the country, and I've seen one where like people had a small amount of marijuana, they just took it from the individual and let them go. They didn't even charge them. Okay, so, but if you, so all right. So, if you get a traffic ticket, it's going to go here. Now, if you feel like your traffic ticket was given to you for the wrong reason. Let's say, how many guys know this? Like, if you see a cop on 235 and you're driving, he's sitting in the median. Have you ever seen people or flashed their lights at people to warn other people?
Yeah.
Okay.
All the time.
Yeah, I do that too. I try and warn people. But let's say you got a ticket for warning that, but there's no law on the books against that. But a cop sees you do it, and he says, "Well, you're impairing other drivers by flashing your bright lights at them, and so we're going to give you a ticket for that." Okay, so say there's no law against it, but they gave you a ticket for it. So that's something you could actually challenge in the courts and say this was. We're going to get to this. There's something called substantive due process and procedural due process. Procedural due process is the procedure of, if you're arrested, you have to have your rights read to you, Miranda rights. Okay, within 72 hours, they got to let you go unless they charge you. You have to be brought before a judge. That's procedural. Okay, substantive due process deals with the law that you're being charged with violating. So if you feel like the law doesn't exist or the law is unconstitutional that you were charged with violating, then you can challenge based on different factors, okay, of constitutionality, which could turn it into a federal case. You follow me? So jurisdiction of where these trials begin, that's called original jurisdiction. Where it begins, does most begin here. They can turn to this, okay? And about 5% of cases are federal. That will begin here at the federal district court, which is a trial court. These are appeals courts, right? This is a trial court. These are trial courts, okay? You have two types of courts. You have criminal courts and you have civil courts as well, which can confuse us. Most of what we're going to be talking about is criminal courts. Okay, so speeding is a crime. Okay, so that goes through the criminal courts. So if you don't like the decision handed down here, you can appeal. Now, these courts, these appeals courts, they don't look at the facts and the evidence. They look at the process. Did you get a fair trial? Did you get a fair hearing? Did the judge issue the instructions to the jury properly? Was everything carried out correctly? Did you have due process? Does that make sense? Yeah.
What is it called when you have your first ticket and try to get off your record?
The diversion?
Yeah. Does that still go to the court?
Yeah, I've never done that.
No,
It depends how severe it is. Because my sister was like speeding.
So sometimes diversions can get it wiped off, right?
But that's only for
Yeah,
years.
if you don't get a ticket for 6 months after your ticket, well, like for me it was 6, but then it just, that's how it goes away.
Yeah.
That's only your first ticket though, right?
No, my sister's got all of those.
You can get, you didn't have to pay more. You just
Got
got
free.
It's like $500
Yeah, you have to
instead of
pay.
like $180.
The second time?
Like it just
Oh, the ticket's 180. You
Yeah,
pay
the ticket's
500.
double.
You're buying your way out of a ticket
Yeah.
for your insurance company purposes.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not doing that. Okay. All right. So
Just don't get the ticket.
okay. Now let me just cover this real quick again. Okay. So here, what happens? Okay, let's say a federal crime, robbing a bank. Because it's a member of the Federal Reserve, it's a federal crime when you rob a bank. Okay? News story out of Cleveland. This guy just got out of jail for robbing a bank. The day he got out of jail, he robbed the same bank.
Oh my God. Idiot.
Going back to jail.
Beast.
Okay? Well, yeah. That's what.
Ballsy. He made some good. It's a bold move. I like it.
Yeah. Okay, so you rob a bank or you beat up a federal employee like a mailman. Okay?
You're gonna beat up a mailman? That's so mean.
That's a federal employee. It's a federal crime.
He probably had weapons all for it.
Okay? You steal mail, wire fraud.
What does
It's
mystery
your
break?
Yeah.
Would the car accident that happened last weekend, would that be considered a federal crime since he was an off-duty officer?
No. Now, if he was an FBI agent, maybe. Okay, so what's going to happen here is if you get convicted of robbing a bank, let's say you were a driver in a car, you dropped somebody off at the bank, you had no idea they were going in there to rob the bank. They went in and robbed the bank, and you get pulled over, you're an accessory, okay? Well, you really believe you're innocent, okay? I mean, you can appeal that. What you're going to get here, guys, is a 3-judge panel. 3 of these 24 will hear your appeal. Okay, that's why they have 24 judges. They rotate, okay, and take these different cases up. Okay, same thing here. You're going to get a panel of judges to hear your appeal. But again, they're not arguing the merits of the case. It's usually the merits of the trial and of the law. Okay. Yes.
So when they do that, is it through like video or is it like everything's documented so you just go through the document?
You'll be able to make an appearance before the judges, and your lawyers will be able to make arguments. Obviously, anytime you're dealing with appeals, there's also what are called written briefs that lawyers will submit before the hearing takes place, so that the judges can read about the case before you come and talk to them. Okay.
How consequential is the case to the process if it's not what's being inspected?
Okay, repeat.
Like, how much, like, are you talking about because you said appeals court is like, if there's a violation of process?
Yes.
So, when you say case, do you mean what the violation was, or what the original case was that led to the violation?
They're going to be reviewing the proceedings, the trial, the arrest, everything that went into your process of being found guilty.
Okay.
So they're going to review that process to make sure that, including the law, whether that law is right or wrong, constitutional or not, they're going to review all of that. But the person that is appealing is probably going to have some specific things that they saw that were not right.
Okay.
So let me give you an example.
Well, so when you say that they got a briefing, it was just on the process.
Right. Yep. They may give some background on the crime itself. Let me give you an example here, real quick. The Carr brothers. Okay. Are you guys familiar with the Carr brothers?
Is that the ones who killed all those people?
They killed
and then
four people, one survived. Okay. Yep. Out of Greenwich. Okay. So those two were found guilty, and in these courts. Okay. And then they appealed, denied, and then later on, because they were found guilty and sentenced to death, the appeals process is more lengthy. And so the lawyers appealed that the brothers should have been sentenced separately rather than together. And the Kansas Supreme Court bought that argument that the two men should have been sentenced separately because one was kind of the leader and the other one was following, that sort of thing. So when the Kansas Supreme Court overturned their death penalty conviction, okay, they're still guilty, but they overturned it because of the process, meaning that they would just have life in prison. The state of Kansas, attorneys from the state of Kansas, yes, sued to the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn the Kansas Supreme Court. And so the state attorney general argued in front of the U.S. Supreme Court that the Kansas State Supreme Court was wrong about overturning this death penalty case. Okay? So you do get appeals from here to here. You can appeal from here to here. Okay? You can appeal from here to here. This is rare. This one is rare. Okay, usually it goes through this process. This is the most common. Okay, with federal cases, you know, it just goes here to here. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court only takes cases it wants to hear. It cannot take all the appeals that people have. There's only 9 justices, and there's only so many days in a year. So there's a limit to what they can take. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but if 4 of the 9 want to hear a case, they'll take the case. Okay? A lot of times the Supreme Court won't take cases they don't feel the American people are ready for them to decide. They'll delay that. They just won't take the case. So generally what happens is the lower court ruling stands if the Supreme Court doesn't take an appeal. Okay? They took the Carr brother appeal and they said the Kansas State Supreme Court is off their rocker to overturn this death penalty case. It was a 9-0 decision overturning the state of Kansas Supreme Court. Okay. Now, the 9th Circuit Court is California, the West Coast. Okay? They get overturned. Their circuit gets overturned by the Supreme Court something like 60% of the time. They have very liberal judges on the 9th Circuit. Okay, so they make these really bad decisions, and the Supreme Court's almost always overturning their decisions. Okay, yeah. So federal judges, I mean, these people serve for life. It's important who sits on these benches. Okay, and Thomas Jefferson dealt with this when he was president. There was one of the circuits that was created, and you can't get rid of these judges unless they commit a crime. You can't impeach them unless they've really committed a bad crime. But what you can do is convince Congress to do away with the court, because they created it. Jefferson convinced Congress to do away with one of the circuit courts, which means all those judges lost their jobs, and then Congress created a new court, and they got all new judges. Remember when Roosevelt wanted to do the court packing thing?
Yeah.
And add 6, the Supreme Court, and we were talking about, one branch of government trying to, run another branch of government. That's what Jefferson did and Congress did. They just got rid of that circuit, got rid of all those judges, and then created a new one. And he got to choose all new judges. You just can't see that happening in 2018. That would never happen today. Okay, so you got a pretty good idea what is meant by a dual court system here. Okay? All right, so just some stuff you already know, guys. Appointed federal judges appointed by the President, approved by the Senate. State judges, now every state's going to be a little different. Generally appointed by the governor, approved by the state legislature, and retained by the vote of the people. That's Kansas. Now, the governor of Kansas, to choose the Kansas Supreme Court justices, gets to choose from a list of candidates that the Kansas Bar Association gives them. So Governor Collier or Brownback before him, if there's a vacancy on the court, they don't get to pick whoever they want. They get to pick from a list of the Kansas Bar. Okay, which is limits, And you can imagine the Kansas Bar is probably, left or right leaning. You could probably figure that out. So, governors really kind of have their hands tied a little bit. Okay? Now, as far as retained by the vote of the people, when you guys go vote next time, November 18, if you register, there's going to be some judges on there, and it's going to give you their name, and it's going to say, do you want to retain this judge, yes or no? Okay? Most people don't pay attention to that. Okay, so the Kansas Supreme Court had to overturn 2 death penalty cases. Both of those decisions by the Kansas Supreme Court were overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay? And if you're paying attention to funding of education and so forth in the state, the Kansas Supreme Court has stuck their nose into the legislature's business. And so there was a move to try and get some of these Supreme Court justices where you would say no. In the last election, there were 4 justices up for retainment. I voted no on 3 of the 4. the state voted to retain all of them. Okay? And I was on Facebook and I was putting these names out, vote no on these judges. Okay? And down here in Wichita, the majority of people voted not to retain those. But up in Johnson County and so forth, the word didn't get out about these judges apparently, or people supported them, and they were retained. So from time to time, we'll get the opportunity to remove some of these judges or keep them. Local judges are elected like people running for state legislature. In some states, it's very interesting. Judges run under a political party. In some states, they don't run under a political party. Okay? Kansas does it they run under a party. Because that gives you an idea of what their ideology is. You know what I mean? If they're running as a Republican, you generally know what their political beliefs are like. If they're running as a Democrat, you generally know what their political beliefs are like. And that helps you choose judges. But in those states where they don't, then you got to do a little research. You know? And I'm as guilty as the next person going into some of these elections not knowing. And I'm a government teacher. Okay? But the Catholic Church does some voting guides and that sort of thing. A lot of times they'll talk about these judges and so forth. If you could use those if you want, as a resource. Okay? All right, terms and pay. Federal judges are appointed for life. Unless they resign, retire, or die, they can be impeached by the Senate. The process is very similar to impeachment of the president or vice president, where the House would bring up impeachment charges on these federal judges. Then the Senate would hold a trial. Okay, the vice president would be the judge in that case. Where you're impeaching the president, the Supreme Court justice is the judge, the Senate is the jury. Same process, just different judge. Okay. Supreme Court judges make $244,400. Pretty good salary. Okay. Court officers. This is goes for both federal and state courts generally. This is on the test. There's 4 people. Okay. Can you name the 4 people that are in the court? The judge, the clerk, the bailiff, which is the cop that's in there, and then the stenographer, the person that records everything that's said. Okay. You can take classes and become a stenographer if you like. It's a job, pretty good job. Okay. Any of you guys ever watch any of these TV court shows? Like Judge Judy?
Yes.
Okay. The first one was Judge Wapner. He was the first one. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the movie Rain Man. Okay. The guy's autistic, and he's always talking about Judge Wapner's on at 11. Judge Wapner, I got to watch Judge Wapner. But these court TV shows are, microcosms of how the system works. Are we almost? Or you guys are gathering up?
Yeah.
All right, hey kids, we'll get back after tomorrow. Okay. You guys have a great day.
Like, comment, subscribe.
Yes, like, comment, and subscribe. Bye.